Hi, I'm Skinny Cheeks. I hope you all are having a great week. Originally, after reading the Week 4 PTS patch notes, I wasn't going to make a video because there really weren't any significant changes, and I don't expect at this rate we'll be getting much in Week 5 either, but if anything important does happen, I'll make sure to keep you all up to date. However, after seeing that there were some comments on the forums from ZOS in response to player feedback, particularly about Sorcerers and Templars, well, I found these responses to be rather interesting, and so I wanted to take a little bit of time to jump into that. So this is from the forum manager Kevin. Hi all, we took your feedback to the combat team regarding the state of Sorcerer. We have a few comments to share. We know survivability has been a concern with Sorcerer given the feedback received and some of the data. We increased Sorcerer survivability this update by giving a sizable buff to shields. We'll continue evaluating and investigating as we go live as well. And I really liked this change that was in the week 1 patch notes. This makes the Sorcerer Shield really stand out from the light armor one. It's a straight up buff for Magicka-based Sorcerers. It gives the stamina-based sorcerer access to a much larger shield than they had before, though I would like to see this scale off of stamina as an option as well going forward. And then for those tanking on their Sorc, this is going to be a really massive shield. Overall, I'm pretty happy with this buff though, and I'm interested to see what people can do with that big shield, especially for tanking. But let's continue on. We've also seen feedback regarding pet versus non-pet builds, specifically wanting more options for non-pet builds. While there will be no changes to this in Update 37, we want to acknowledge this sentiment, and the team is monitoring this. We want to make sure when thinking about this and reviewing feedback, we're keeping the class presentation for pet sorcerer in mind, while also allowing for class diversity for those who want to play non-pet sorcerer. This is another win, I think. No, there aren't any changes for Update 37, which is slightly disappointing, but just the fact that they are acknowledging that this is a pain point, well, I think that's a good sign. This is some feedback I've been seeing for a long time, and I've been submitting for a long time as well, so I'm glad that at the very least they are investigating a way to improve this aspect of sorcerers. So those first 2 paragraphs were actually pretty good. This next one though, oof. Regarding sorcerers and their lack of unique buffs and debuffs, this is intentional. And there are no current plans to change this. Sorcerers do have some unique abilities in their kit, like silences. However, not locking Sorcerer into having unique buffs and debuffs allows for more class diversity in group environments. So I'll just straight up say I completely disagree with their thought process here. This is disconnected from the way that the game is generally played and the way that players make decisions when putting together groups. It's a bit disturbing to see that they intentionally don't want Sorcs to bring something unique to the table for a group. They mentioned silences there, referring to their negate ultimate, but this doesn't work for 90% of the enemies in PvE. The encounter team has decided that any notable enemy will just be immune to this. So while yes, it can be nice in some PvP fights, it is extremely rare for it to be a reason to have a sorcerer in PvE content. For the end game, there isn't a lot of reason to bring sorcerers along right now, and part of that is their class minor passive that I've been complaining about since hybridization was first introduced. The passive is good, but if you have a Nightblade in the group, essentially you only need one or the other, so it can be redundant. Many groups have opted to go with a Nightblade support instead of a Sorc because of their other group utility that they offer, such as Major and Minor Cowardice to debuff enemies, as well as 15% extra resource recovery tied to one of their healing abilities that they would already be using anyways as an AoE heal over time. So what does Sorcerers bring for the group? Well, they have the Conduit synergy, which can be a nice bit of extra DPS if it is dropped on cooldown, so this is really nice for a Sorcerer DPS to be running to help support the group. But for a tank or a healer, this is something they'd have to specifically make room for in their kit, as it's not the natural kind of ability that you would slot on a support role. And then Sorcerers also have access to that 15% boost to recoveries, but it's tied to one of their shield morphs and the not as strong for the user morph of that shield. So again, you have to make room for an ability that you might not want to slot for an encounter if you want to provide that as a sorcerer, compared again to Nightblade or Warden, who would get this on a group heal that they're probably already running. And then Sorcerers do also provide Major Berserk for the group for a short duration with their Atronach ultimate. This is a pretty nice buff, but there are other sources now with Update 37, which has diminished the value of this a bit. So you can see when you break down the different pieces of the sorcerer and what they bring to a group setting, nothing is really that important, or it is easily sourced elsewhere. And I'll show compared to a class just loaded with utility ability, the Dragonknight, here in just a bit. If you take a look at most of the trials, especially the hard modes on ESO logs, you can see just how few sorcerers are being brought to groups compared to other classes. And this is with Sorcerer actually being a really popular class to play overall. My Sorcerer guides always seem to get more views than the other classes, so I know there's a lot of interest there, but that does not directly translate to them being popular in end-game content. So I think ZOS is going the opposite direction they should be here. They shouldn't be intentionally not giving the Sorcerer anything unique, because right now that's hurting class diversity, which is the very thing they're saying they're trying to avoid doing. There should be more reasons to bring Sorcerers to the group. So I really hope they consider revisiting that one and talking through it a bit more internally. And I'll have this thread linked in the description if you want to go through it. I won't read through all the responses here, but when I last checked, I did not see a single response that was happy about this particular paragraph. Seriously, revisit those minor class passives. That's such an easy win across the board. And then from there, you could consider maybe adding in additional unique features, maybe more synergies tied to sorcerer skills, have them provide more in that department than any other class, something to make them more appealing to bring to the group. All right, let's move on to the final paragraph here for sorcerers. Lastly, we want to reiterate the notion of classes having strengths and weaknesses. Sorcerer, like every other class, cannot be good at everything. This is part of building class identity. There are ways for players to bridge the gap through gear, consumables, etc. That does not negate us from addressing problem areas, but it does mean there will be times where elements of a class will struggle compared to others. That is okay and a part of building unique gameplay experiences. So I have mixed feelings about the response here. I'm not totally against that idea of certain classes being better at some things than others. In theory, that makes for a far more interesting dynamic between the different classes, but this also goes directly against their class diversity idea that they just said they were shooting for, and also against the play how you want mantra. If certain classes are not good at certain encounters, players are not likely to bring them for those encounters. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing if that's the way that it works out, so long as those classes that are left out there are the best for other encounters. So if you are going that route, you need to make sure that the wealth is distributed evenly, so to speak. And right now, it just doesn't feel like sorcerers are topping the charts for anything. Yes, their single target damage is really nice, but that's about all they have going for them in PvE. So I think it either needs to be that every class can handle most things really well, or otherwise you better get that balance right if you want to try and divvy it up. So as I said, mixed feelings here. I think this could be okay, but it's definitely the harder route for them to try to get right. But let's move on to the comment on Templars now. In addition to taking feedback to the team about Sorc, we also took your feedback to the team regarding the state of Templars. We want to follow up on how the team uses feedback to inform combat and balance changes. The combat team is always looking at data from various points of play, PvE, PvP, low-end to high-end damage parse, group content and solo play, etc., and collective feedback across the board to make informed balance adjustments. Many of the previous adjustments to Templar were directly made off of those points. While there are no planned changes to Templar in Update 37 outside of anything already highlighted in the patch notes, we're evaluating ever-changing data and will continue to adjust around issues when they arise. Your continued feedback will be a part of that process. So essentially, thanks for the feedback with Update 37, but we're not doing anything right now. I'll admit Templar is in a bit trickier spot than Sorcerer to balance, but that doesn't mean there aren't some good adjustments that can be made. There are certain areas of the game, notably solo and 4-person dungeons and arenas, where Templars are really good. For 12-person trials though, a lot of the content does not play well with the Templars kit, and so when you're not bringing them for their damage potential, there aren't really many other reasons to have them in the group. So let's take a look at Power of the Light. This used to be highly desired, and that Minor Breach was something unique that Templars brought to the group. But now Minor Breach has been distributed to what seems like half of the abilities in the game at this point. Okay, that's a slight exaggeration, but it is super easy to get in many different ways now. Then you have their Spear Shards synergy. This one would be really great, especially the Luminous Shard synergy, since this morph restores both resources instead of just the highest. However, it shares a cooldown with the Orb synergy, so even if you do have it going, half the time you're not going to see it because you will be on cooldown from the Orb. So I think a really easy win here is to just give Templars their own separate synergy cooldown for this ability and still have the whole group able to take it the way that the Orb synergy can be taken. This would be a huge huge boon for group play. And then you have their class minor passive, Minor Sorcery. This is completely redundant in organized group play because you can have a Dragonknight in the group providing igneous weapons, and therefore you also have that Dragonknight providing minor brutality. I won't get too deep into DKs, but let's take a look at what all they can bring really quick. So they have those major and minor buffs that we just mentioned for the group's damage stats. They have Stagger for increasing damage for the group for every tick of damage, Engulfing Flames for the increased flame damage for the group. For the DPS, there is a synergy on their main ultimate, Shackle, which provides a little bit of extra DPS for the group. Also the Ignite synergy for more damage from Talons, and then tanks have Igneous Shield that provides small shields for the group as well. If you look at this, it just feels incredibly lopsided compared to other classes, and I would hate to see any of these awesome things taken away from the Dragonknight, but the opposite actually. I just think that the Dragonknight should be the standard for what classes should bring to the table for group play. So all of this said, you really just eliminate the need altogether for minor sorcery from a Templar by having a much more desirable Dragonknight. And just like the Sorcerer minor passive, it just needs to be updated. I don't understand how ZOS can be happy with the minor passives and the state that they're currently in. They pushed hybridization, but then they have these weird minor passives that only do one or the other, and they end up redundant. So Templar went from being necessary before the hybridization for Magicka groups to not really being needed in any group. And I've given feedback every patch since the hybridization that these class minors need to be updated, and for some reason that feedback is continuously ignored. This is a pain point. It's not a good passive and it needs to be updated. Please revisit this. Solar Barrage is another skill that I've been harping on for a while now. It's okay in situations where you're moving a lot and pre-casting skills in between phases, since it's essentially a free global cooldown at that point. But outside of that, it's not really great, with its Empower buff being the only thing that's really going for it. If you use Oaken Soul, you don't need Empower for your heavy attacks, and if you aren't doing a heavy attack build, then that Empower buff is useless. So this could be a really nice buff to the AoE potential of Templars if they will take this skill in a bit different direction. And then you might say, well, Solar Prison has a really strong synergy on it. You can't list the DK ultimate and not list this one for Templars. Well, the DK ultimate is a really strong ultimate to use for damage for PvE, whereas the Solar Prison one is very underwhelming aside from the big synergy. If Solar Prison would get a unique buff or debuff instead of that 10% major maim and last 15 seconds to put it on par with other AoE ultimates, then we could start comparing the synergy it has to the DK synergy. Now, I did want to point out one reason that I am seeing Templars being brought to organized group play, and that is their Purify synergy. This synergy is persistent even when there is no effect around to Purify, and so what that does is allow the Alkosh wearer to have a very reliable synergy to activate if the timer on that Alkosh debuff is running low. So this is definitely nice to have, no doubt about that, but it seems like an extremely narrow and niche path to Templar desirability. So to sum it up, I'm really excited that they are looking into non-pet Sorcs and hopefully finding a way to make that playstyle a bit more desirable. But it seems like they are a bit content with the current state of Sorcerers and Templars, and that's a bit worrisome. I think their stated mentality that they don't want to create unique things for these classes to bring to group play is actually completely backwards from where we should be with this. Dragonknights should be the standard when looking at a class kit and seeing how many different pieces they bring for group utility. Now, if every class was set up in a similar way, obviously with different types of bonuses that they could bring, I think the overall balance of classes brought into content would be in a much better spot. But that's the feedback I have for today. Thanks a bunch, as always, for watching. Let me know what you guys think about ZOS's response. I want to give a shout out to my Patreon supporters and YouTube members. The contributions help a ton to keep the website and YouTube channel going. And a special thanks to Nicholas, Simon, Cougars Bay and the Cougar City Guild, the Order of War Guild, Cantankerous Cat, Shady, Iffy, Blake1816, Mordecai1212, Santanico, Vidridi, Florian, Phoenix, Nolandia, Unemployed, Cristeliana, Cha-Cha, and Technical KO. Thanks again, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye.